There are 10,000 ways to die in the 41st millennium, but Governor Malthos had just discovered there was something infinitely worse than dying. Being kept alive by beings who had perfected suffering into an art form. As he stood atop the command bunker's ramparts, watching crimson smoke rise from Settlement 7, he thought the Orks were the worst thing that could happen to his world. He was catastrophically wrong. The greenskins had been brutal in their simplicity, crude choppers carving through human flesh with savage efficiency, their daka turning families into red mist in seconds. 3 weeks of Ork raids had reduced the thriving agri-world of Tertius Prime to a patchwork of burning fields and makeshift graveyards. But at least with Orks, the suffering ended quickly. A swift death, a final scream, and then merciful darkness. If you crave more tales from the Dark Millennium, smash that subscribe button, because what's coming next will make you grateful for the Emperor's protection. And what you're about to witness makes Ork brutality look like children playing with wooden swords. Governor Malthos adjusted his microbead, listening to the crackling reports from his beleaguered PDF forces. Sector 12 reporting all clear, sir. Found more bodies, but... The Vox operator's voice faltered with confusion that would soon transform into unimaginable terror. Something's different about these ones. Different how? The Orks had been consistent in their brutality. Smash, grab, kill, move on. It was predictable, almost reassuring in its simplicity. War boss Scarjaw and his deaf skulls had followed the standard greenskin pattern. Overwhelming force, random violence, crude looting, then departure to find the next fight. But over the past day, the reports had grown strange. Bodies found in impossible positions, wounds that defied explanation. Survivors babbling about shadows that moved independent of their owners. "Sir," came another voice through the static, urgency bleeding through the Vox distortion. "You need to see this immediately. Grid reference Gamma 77, the Peterson farmstead. Emperor preserve us, sir, but this wasn't Orks." The transport Valkyrie cut through the ash-thick air, its engines struggling against the weight of debris and smoke that hung over Tertius Prime like a funeral shroud. Below, the once green fields stretched out like a wounded animal, scarred black and red by weeks of Ork raids. The Peterson farm had been a model settlement. 3 generations of loyal Imperial citizens who'd turned barren soil into productive cropland through backbreaking labor and unwavering faith in the Emperor's protection. Now it looked like a canvas painted by a madman who understood geometry. The Valkyrie set down in what had been the main courtyard, and Governor Malthos stepped out into air that reeked not just of smoke and blood, but of exotic spices and something that might have been expensive perfume. His respirator filtered the acrid atmosphere, but couldn't block the sight that made his blood freeze in his veins. The bodies weren't just dead. They were arranged, positioned with artistic precision that spoke of intelligence, patience, and something infinitely more terrifying than Ork brutality. "Emperor preserve us," whispered Lieutenant Voss, the PDF officer who'd made the discovery. His face had gone corpse-pale beneath his helmet. "The greenskins didn't do this, sir. Couldn't have done this. This is something else entirely." Malthos approached the nearest corpse. Old man Peterson himself, the patriarch who'd fought off 2 previous Ork raids with nothing but a stubber and righteous fury. He was suspended 3 meters off the ground, impaled on a series of crystalline spikes that emerged from a device of impossible elegance. The wounds were surgical, precise, designed to cause maximum pain while avoiding vital organs. Peterson's face was frozen in an expression of such pure agony that Malthos had to look away. But it was the other details that sent ice through his veins. Peterson's fingernails had been carefully removed, and arranged in a perfect spiral pattern around the base of the device. His eyes had been replaced with tiny, pulsing gems that seemed to track movement with malevolent intelligence. And worst of all, the man's chest still rose and fell in shallow, mechanical breaths. "He's still alive," Lieutenant Voss said unnecessarily, his voice cracking despite years of military training. As if summoned by his realization, shadows began to move at the edges of their vision. Not the natural shadows cast by Tertius Prime's dying sun, but darker shapes that seemed to exist independent of any light source. They flowed across the ground like liquid darkness, approaching the horrified Imperial forces with predatory grace that made Orc stealth tactics look like children playing hide-and-seek. Governor Malthos reached for his sidearm, knowing with absolute certainty that his last pistol would be as effective against these shadows as prayers against the void. Behind him, his men raised their weapons with the futile defiance of cornered prey facing apex predators. The last coherent thought that passed through his mind before the shadows reached him was a prayer. Not for victory, not for the strength to fight, but for the simple mercy of a quick death like the Orks would have provided. Because somewhere in the depths of his soul, he understood that whatever had created this artistic nightmare had moved far beyond the crude concept of killing. They had discovered something infinitely worse than death. They had learned to make dying last forever. The shadows moved with liquid precision, flowing around the PDF troopers like sentient darkness given form. Governor Malthos watched in horrified fascination as Lieutenant Voss raised his laser rifle, the ruby beam cutting through the air where a shadow had been mere microseconds before. The darkness simply reformed, coalescing into a humanoid shape that towered over the young officer with predatory amusement. "Contact protocols, sir," Voss shouted, his training kicking in even as terror threatened to overwhelm his composure. "Should we call for Space Marine support?" The question died in his throat as the shadow thing tilted its head, studying him with the clinical interest of a medici examining a particularly fascinating specimen. When it spoke, its voice was like silk dragged across broken glass, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. "Space Marines?" The words carried an accent that spoke of ancient nobility and refined cruelty. "Oh, sweet little monkey, we have faced your Adeptus Astartes. They scream so beautifully when properly motivated." More shapes emerged from the darkness, tall, impossibly graceful figures clad in armor that seemed to absorb light itself. Their movements were poetry written in violence, each step calculated for maximum psychological impact. These were not the crude, lumbering forms of Orc boys with their random brutality and simple bloodlust. These beings moved with the confidence of apex predators who had spent millennia perfecting the art of inflicting suffering. Malthos found himself studying their equipment with the desperate focus of a man seeking any advantage, however slight. Where Orc technology was crude assemblages of scrap metal held together by belief and violence, these weapons were masterworks of engineering. Splinter rifles that fired crystalline shards designed to deliver paralytic toxins, agonizers that generated pain-inducing neural feedback, electro whips that could flay flesh from bone while keeping the victim conscious throughout the entire process. "You know," one of the figures said conversationally, removing its helmet to reveal features of alien beauty, married to expressions of casual cruelty. "Your greenskin friends provided such limited entertainment. They die too quickly, you see. No appreciation for the finer arts." The speaker was female, her pale skin marked with ritual scars that formed intricate patterns across her face and neck. Her eyes were pools of liquid darkness that seemed to drink in the terror radiating from the Imperial forces. She gestured languidly toward the artistic displays they'd created from the Peterson family, her movements carrying the lazy confidence of a predator selecting its next meal. "Observe the difference in craftsmanship," she continued, her voice carrying the tone of a lecturer addressing students. "Your orcs would have simply chopped these specimens into chunks, perhaps eaten a few choice bits, and moved on to the next settlement. Wasteful, crude, no vision whatsoever." A PDF trooper, young Private Hendricks, barely 18 and still believing the Emperor's light would shield him from harm, broke ranks and sprinted toward the landing pad where their Valkyrie waited. The alien huntress watched his flight with amused interest, making no move to pursue. "Ah, a runner," she purred. "How delightful. Sisters, shall we demonstrate proper hunting technique?" 3 more figures materialized from shadows that shouldn't have existed, their movements synchronized with balletic precision. They didn't chase Private Hendricks, they herded him, appearing at precisely the right moments to turn his desperate flight into an elaborate dance of terror. Each near escape was carefully orchestrated, each moment of hope deliberately cultivated, only to be crushed at the perfect psychological moment. When Hendricks finally collapsed, sobbing and broken, barely 20 meters from the transport that represented salvation, the huntress nodded with professional satisfaction. "Notice how we preserved the specimen's capacity for hope throughout the chase," she explained to her captive audience. "Hope is the most exquisite spice for suffering. Without it, pain becomes merely physical. With it," she smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to elegant points. "With it, agony becomes transcendent." Governor Malthos felt his worldview reshaping itself around this terrible revelation. The orc raids he'd endured for weeks suddenly seemed like natural disasters, brutal, but ultimately comprehensible. Storms destroyed, fires consumed, earthquakes shattered, and orcs killed. All were forces of nature, terrible but lacking malice. This was different. This was intelligence wedded to cruelty, sophistication married to sadism, art born from atrocity. These beings didn't simply kill, they curated suffering like connoisseurs collecting rare wines. "Please," Lieutenant Voss said, his voice cracking despite years of military training. "We have wounded, civilians. Take what you want, but let the innocents go." The huntress laughed, a sound like crystal bells shattering in a cathedral. "Oh, precious little monkey. You still think in terms of wants and needs. We don't want your resources. We don't need your territory." She leaned closer, her breath carrying the scent of exotic spices and old blood. "We hunger for something far more precious. Your capacity to feel despair." As if responding to some unheard signal, more shadows began emerging from impossible angles. Not the crude reinforcements of orc boys responding to the sound of battle, but calculated deployment of specialized forces. Each new arrival was a study in lethal artistry, their equipment designed not just to kill, but to extract maximum suffering from the process. The difference crystallized in Malthos's mind with terrible clarity. Orcs were a force of nature, destructive, chaotic, but ultimately finite. These beings were something far worse. They were an art form that fed on pain itself. The hunt began with mathematical precision that would have impressed a Tau Firecast strategist, but where the Tau sought efficiency in warfare, these alien predators sought perfection in terror. The lead huntress, who introduced herself with aristocratic formality as Lelith Nexara of the witch cult of the Severed Chain, raised her hand in a gesture that somehow conveyed both royal command and theatrical flourish. "Positions, my darlings," she called to her followers, her voice carrying across the courtyard with crystalline clarity. "Remember, we're not mere butchers like those tedious greenskins. We are artists, and these monkey are our canvas. Governor Malthos watched in horrified fascination as the Drukhari hunters spread out with predatory grace. Unlike orc boys who would charge forward in a chaotic green tide, screaming and firing randomly until something died, these aliens moved with the calculated precision of apex predators who had spent millennia perfecting their craft. 3 witches flanked left, their movements synchronized like dancers rehearsing a deadly ballet. Their weapons, hydra gauntlets that could extend razor-sharp filaments, impaler pistols loaded with barbed projectiles designed to cause maximum tissue damage without immediately fatal wounds, were held with the casual confidence of masters wielding familiar tools. 2 more hunters circled right, their path taking them through the artistic display that had once been the Peterson children. As they passed each suspended figure, they paused to make small adjustments, turning ahead to catch the dying light more dramatically, repositioning a limb to create better visual flow. Even in the midst of a hunt, they couldn't resist perfecting their work. "You see," Lilith explained conversationally as her forces deployed, "your orcs understand only one type of fear, the immediate terror of impending death. Crude, simplistic. It's like comparing a child's finger painting to the masterworks hanging in Commorragh's finest galleries." She gestured toward Private Hendricks, who still lay sobbing near the Valkyrie landing pad. 2 witches had positioned themselves on either side of him, close enough to strike but making no aggressive moves. The young soldier's terror was palpable, his eyes darting between potential threats while his body remained paralyzed by the certainty of doom. "Observe how we layer the experience," Lilith continued, her tone taking on the cadence of a master craftsman explaining technique to apprentices. "First, we establish inevitability. He knows escape is impossible, but we don't immediately remove all hope. That would be wasteful. Instead, we let hope flicker, like a candle flame in a hurricane." As if responding to her words, one of the witches near Hendricks stepped slightly backward, opening what appeared to be a clear path to the transport. The private's breathing quickened, his muscles tensing as primitive survival instincts warred with rational terror. "Now watch," Lilith whispered, her dark eyes fixed on the unfolding drama with the intensity of a patron at the theater. He's calculating, measuring distances, building courage. The hope is taking root. Hendricks made his move, a desperate sprint toward the Valkyrie's open crew compartment. He covered 3 meters before the second witch moved, not to intercept him but to herd him slightly off course. 4 meters. 5. The transport's salvation seemed within reach. The razor wire net deployed with perfect timing, not to capture him but to tear through the muscles of his legs, sending him sprawling mere meters from freedom. His screams echoed across the courtyard, not the brief, violent sound of an orc victim meeting a quick end, but the sustained agony of someone who realized their suffering had only just begun. "Beautiful," Lilith breathed, her scarred features alight with genuine artistic appreciation. "Notice how the proximity to salvation amplifies the despair. An orc would have simply shot him in the back, efficient perhaps, but artistically bankrupt." Lieutenant Voss raised his las rifle with shaking hands, training the weapon on the nearest witch. The alien hunter regarded him with amused interest, making no move to take cover or return fire. Instead, she began to move, not the aggressive charge of an orc boy seeking close combat, but a sinuous, hypnotic dance that seemed to bend space around her. "Shoot her!" Governor Malthos shouted, but his voice sounded distant even to his own ears. The witch's movements were mesmerizing, each step flowing into the next like liquid poetry. Her combat drugs enhanced not just her physical capabilities, but her ability to project an aura of lethal grace that paralyzed prey with its terrible beauty. When Voss finally pulled the trigger, The last bolt passed harmlessly through space the witch had occupied a heartbeat before. She hadn't dodged in the crude, desperate manner of an orc ducking incoming fire. She had simply ceased to exist in that location and reappeared 3 meters to the left, her position shift so smooth it seemed like reality had adjusted itself to accommodate her. "Your greenskin friends at least understand the fundamental nature of combat," she said, her voice somehow audible despite the distance and the weapon's discharge. "They know it's about who dies first. We've transcended such primitive concerns. For us, combat is about who suffers most beautifully." She moved again, and this time Malthos could see the mathematical precision underlying what appeared to be supernatural grace. Every step calculated for maximum psychological impact, every gesture designed to build terror in incremental layers. She wasn't just hunting them, she was conducting a symphony of fear, and they were all instruments in her orchestra. The governor's hand went to his Vox unit, muscle memory driving him to call for reinforcements, even as rational thought told him such appeals were futile. Behind him, his remaining PDF troopers formed a defensive circle, their training asserting itself despite the hopelessness of their situation. But as he watched the Drukhari hunters close in with predatory patience, Governor Malthos understood that they weren't interested in quick victory. They were savoring every moment of the hunt, drawing out each phase like connoisseurs sampling a rare vintage. The Orks had wanted to kill them quickly and move on to the next fight. These aliens wanted something far more precious. They wanted to make the dying last forever. The first incision was a masterpiece of surgical precision that would have impressed even the most skilled Magos biologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Homunculus Vesparian emerged from the shadows like a nightmare given form, his elongated limbs moving with the fluid grace of a conductor approaching his orchestra. Where orc painboys were crude butchers who hammered scrap metal into wounded flesh and called it medicine, Vesparian was an artist whose medium happened to be living tissue. "Ah, fresh specimens," he purred, his voice a sibilant whisper that seemed to echo from within the listeners' own skulls, and so beautifully unspoiled by crude greenskin ministrations. Lieutenant Voss, who had been netted and paralyzed by witch toxins, served as the unwilling demonstration subject for Vesparian's craft. The homunculus approached with tools that defied classification, instruments that seemed part surgical implement, part alien technology, part living organism. His modified hands, extended by bone grafts and tipped with retractable scalpels, moved with the delicate precision of a master artisan. "Your orc friends," Vesparian explained conversationally as he made his first exploratory cut along Voss's forearm. "They understand pain as a byproduct. Crude creatures that they are, they inflict suffering accidentally, through sheer incompetence. But we," the cut deepened, following nerve pathways with anatomical precision. "We have elevated pain to high art." The incision wasn't designed to cause maximum damage, quite the opposite. Vesparian's blade followed the exact path of nerve clusters, severing just enough tissue to amplify sensation while leaving the underlying structure intact. Each cut was calculated to generate exponentially increasing waves of agony without compromising the subject's ability to experience future torments. Governor Malthos, held immobile by a paralytic toxin that left his consciousness completely intact, watched in helpless horror as the homunculus worked. The contrast with orc methodology was terrifyingly stark. A painboy would have simply chopped off Voss's arm and crudely attached a mechanical replacement, probably forgetting to use anesthetic because the concept wouldn't occur to them. The procedure would be over in minutes, the victim either dead from shock or unconscious from blood loss. Vesparian's work was different. Each incision was followed by the application of substances that prevented shock, enhanced nerve sensitivity, and accelerated healing just enough to ensure the wounds would remain fresh and agonizing. He was creating pain that would regenerate itself, suffering that would compound over time rather than diminish. "Notice the artistry," the homunculus continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture to distinguished colleagues. "An orc inflicts trauma and moves on. But observe, he inserted a crystalline shard into the fresh wound, its faceted surface pulsing with bioluminescent energy. This beautiful creation will stimulate nerve growth, ensuring that my subject's capacity for sensation actually increases with time." The shard began to merge with Voss's tissue, its alien structure integrating with human biology in ways that violated every principle of imperial medical science. The lieutenant's screams took on new harmonics as the device established neural connections, creating pathways for pain that human physiology had never been designed to accommodate. "Your orc encounters have been educational, I'm sure," Vesparian mused, moving to Malthos with the unhurried confidence of a master craftsman approaching his next project. "They taught you about sudden death, quick violence, the brutal efficiency of destruction. But they never taught you about the spaces between heartbeats, did they? The eternity that exists in a single moment of perfect agony." The governor's eyes widened as Vesparian's modified hands began their preliminary examination, probing pressure points and nerve clusters with the thoroughness of a medici conducting a physical assessment. But where an imperial physician would be searching for injuries to heal, the homunculus was mapping vulnerabilities to exploit. "Ah yes," Vesparian whispered, his elongated fingers tracing patterns across Malthos's neck and shoulders. "Excellent bone density, strong cardiovascular system, and these stress fractures in your lower vertebrae, old injuries from your youth, I'd wager. Perfect foundations for my next masterpiece." The tools he produced defied easy description. Syringes that seemed to writhe with their own life, filled with substances that shifted color like captured auroras. Microscopic injectors that could deliver precisely measured doses of synthetic neurotransmitters. Probes that could stimulate individual nerve endings with quantum precision. "You see, Governor," Vesparian explained as he began his work, "your greenskin raiders were barbarians who destroyed for the joy of destruction. But we are connoisseurs who create for the love of creation. And what we create..." The first injection sent liquid fire through Malthos's nervous system. "What we create is immortal." The substance flooding his bloodstream wasn't designed to kill or even to cause immediate incapacitation. Instead, it was rewriting his pain receptors at the cellular level, amplifying sensitivity while preventing the merciful numbness that usually accompanied extreme trauma. Each heartbeat became a symphony of sensation, each breath a crescendo of controlled agony. "The beauty of our methods," Vesparian continued, his work proceeding with methodical precision, "is sustainability. An orc victim suffers for minutes, perhaps hours at most, before death provides release. Our subjects can experience optimized agony for centuries, their capacity for pain actually improving with age and experience." Behind him, other homunculi moved among the captured PDF troopers with the business-like efficiency of craftsmen selecting raw materials. Each Imperial soldier became a canvas for their particular expertise. One specialized in skeletal modification, another in neural enhancement, a third in the delicate art of controlled organ replacement. The difference crystallized in Malthos's enhanced consciousness with terrible clarity. The orcs they'd faced were a natural disaster, devastating but ultimately finite. These beings were something far more sophisticated. They were gardeners who cultivated suffering like a crop, tending their victims with the same care a botanist might show to rare orchids. And like any skilled gardeners, They were planning for a very long harvest season. The transport into Commorragh was itself a lesson in refined cruelty that made Orc prisoner transport look like luxury accommodation by comparison, where greenskins would simply throw captives into the back of a crude truck and forget about them until arrival. The Drukhari had designed their slave vessels with the same artistic attention they applied to every other aspect of their dark culture. Governor Malthos found himself suspended in a crystalline web that responded to his biometric signals, tightening its grip whenever his heart rate spiked with terror or rage, loosening just enough to prevent unconsciousness when despair threatened to provide merciful oblivion. The other survivors hung nearby in similar constructs, each one calibrated to their individual psychological profile through methods that would have impressed the Officio Assassinorum's finest mind readers. Lieutenant Voss, his body now adorned with homunculus Vesparian's improvements, served as a living demonstration of their destination's promise. The crystalline shards embedded in his nervous system pulsed in rhythm with the transport's warp engines, each pulse sending cascades of precisely modulated agony through his enhanced neural pathways. His screams had evolved beyond mere human sound into something approaching music, a harmony of suffering that the Drukhari crew listened to with the appreciation of connoisseurs attending a concert. "Welcome, sweet specimens, to the Dark City," announced Archon Malixian, the expedition's leader, as the massive gates of Commorragh materialized beyond the vessel's viewports. "Your greenskin friends, bless their simple hearts, never had the privilege of witnessing our capital's magnificence. They're far too practical for such aesthetic experiences." The view that greeted the captives defied comprehension on multiple levels. Where imperial hive cities were brutal exercises in functional architecture, vast spires designed to house maximum populations with minimal resources, Commorragh was a monument to deliberate excess. Towering spires of impossible geometry twisted skyward like frozen screams, their surfaces covered in living murals that writhed and shifted with each observer's emotional state. But it was the scale of the suffering that truly distinguished it from anything the Orks might construct. The greenskins built crude amphitheaters for their occasional gladiatorial contests, rough circles of scrap metal where boys could watch other boys fight until one died. Commorragh's arenas were architectural marvels that could house millions of spectators, their acoustics precisely engineered to carry every scream, every sob, every whimper to the furthest seats with perfect clarity. "Behold the nexus of shadows." Archon Malixian gestured toward a massive coliseum that dominated the city's central district. 50,000 years of continuous operation, with not a single day's interruption in the entertainment. Your imperial records speak of gladiatorial contests lasting mere hours. We measure our performances in decades. The transport descended through layers of the Dark City, each level revealing new horrors that dwarfed anything Malthos had imagined possible. Hanging gardens where the vegetation was composed entirely of living neural tissue, their branches swaying to the rhythm of transmitted pain. Markets where merchants traded in bottled screams, crystallized despair, and refined terror extracted from countless species across the galaxy. "Still with us in the darkness?" The Archon's voice carried a note of genuine concern. "Hit that like button if this tale chills your soul, because the true artistry hasn't even begun yet." Private Hendricks, whose legs had been artistically modified during the hunt, hung nearby in his own crystalline web. The young soldier had stopped screaming hours ago, not from acceptance or resignation, but because his vocal cords had been precisely damaged to produce only specific tones when stressed. He had become a living instrument, capable of generating only the notes that his captors found aesthetically pleasing. Your Orc encounters taught you about the randomness of violence, Malixian continued, as they passed through a district where entire buildings pulsed with bioluminescent organs harvested from countless victims. They showed you how brutality could emerge from simple minds, driven by base instincts. But randomness, dear monkey, is the enemy of true art. The transport settled into a docking bay that was itself a masterpiece of intimidation. The walls were lined with alcoves containing what appeared to be statues of various alien species caught in poses of ultimate agony. Only as they drew closer did Malthos realize that the statues were still breathing, their eyes tracking movement with the desperate hope of beings who had long since abandoned any dream of rescue, but still clung to the possibility of acknowledgement. Each of these specimens, the Archon explained, noting the governor's horrified fascination, represents decades of careful cultivation. That lovely Tau fire warrior, we've had her for 37 years, slowly perfecting the balance between hope and despair in her neural chemistry. The space marine beside her took significantly longer, of course. Astartes are remarkably resistant to psychological conditioning, but given sufficient time and artistic vision, the marine in question was a sight that would haunt Malthos's enhanced memories for whatever eternity awaited him. The warrior's power armor had been replaced by an organic exoskeleton that amplified every sensation while preventing any possibility of death. His gene-enhanced physiology, designed to endure unimaginable trauma in service to the Emperor, had been turned against him, his superhuman endurance transformed into a curse that ensured his suffering would continue long after any normal human would have found peace in madness or death. The beauty of our methods, Malixian mused as the transport's crew began preparing their captives for transfer, lies in the permanence of the experience. Your Orcs create momentary suffering, intense certainly, but brief. We create eternal masterpieces. As the crystalline webs began to retract, delivering the Imperial captives into the hands of waiting racks and grotesques, Malthos caught a final glimpse through the viewports of Commorragh's impossible skyline. In the distance, he could see other transports arriving from countless raids across the galaxy, each carrying fresh specimens for the Dark City's insatiable appetite. The difference between Orc raids and Drukhari expeditions crystallized in his enhanced consciousness with perfect, terrible clarity. The greenskins took what they needed and moved on, leaving only corpses and rubble behind. But the Dark Eldar took something far more precious. They took the capacity for suffering itself and transformed it into art that would endure until the heat death of the universe. And somewhere in the Dark City's impossible depths, new galleries were even now being prepared for their arrival. The rack-designated specimen crafter Thylos approached Governor Malthos with the methodical precision of a master artisan evaluating raw materials. Where Orc pain boys were crude butchers who hammered metal plates over wounds and declared their patients fixed, Thylos represented the pinnacle of surgical artistry, refined over millennia of practice on unwilling subjects. His own form was a testament to the homunculi craft. Limbs elongated beyond natural proportions, additional arms grafted with seamless precision, and a skull modified to accommodate enhanced sensory organs that could perceive pain across multiple spectrums of existence. Each modification had been performed while he remained conscious, transforming his own suffering into wisdom that he now applied to others. "Fascinating specimen," Thylos murmured, his voice emerging from a throat restructured to produce harmonic overtones that resonated directly with the listener's fear centers. "Your crude greenskin encounters have left such delightful stress fractures throughout your psyche. Perfect foundation points for my next masterpiece." The surgical bay around them defied every principle of imperial medical science. Where Space Marine apothecaries worked in sterile environments designed to preserve life and function, this chamber was a fusion of laboratory, art studio, and torture chamber that prioritized aesthetic achievement over mere survival. The walls pulsed with organic circuits that monitored not just the physical state of subjects, but their emotional resonance, their capacity for hope, their potential for despair. Lieutenant Voss was already secured to the primary operating table, if such a crude term could be applied to the biomechanical construct that interfaced directly with his nervous system. The device didn't simply restrain him. It had formed neural connections that allowed the racks to experience his sensations as if they were their own, providing real-time feedback on the effectiveness of their modifications. "Your Ork friends," Thylos explained as he selected his first instruments from a collection that seemed to shift and writhe with its own life. "They understand modification only in the crudest sense. Chop off a limb, bolt on a mechanical replacement, hope for the best. Artistically bankrupt, really." The first incision followed the same principles Homunculus Vesparian had demonstrated. But Thylos's technique was even more refined. Where Vesparian had focused on enhancing existing pain receptors, Thylos was creating entirely new neural pathways, biological circuits designed to process sensations that human consciousness had never been equipped to handle. "Observe," he said, his additional arms manipulating microscopic instruments with balletic grace. "How we preserve the essential humanity of our subjects while expanding their capacity for experience. An Ork would simply replace your friend's nervous system with crude cybernetics. We prefer to enhance the original." The biomechanical tendril that emerged from the operating construct interfaced directly with Voss's spinal column, its crystalline core pulsing with data streams that contained compressed experiences of agony harvested from thousands of previous subjects. The lieutenant's body convulsed as alien sensations flooded his consciousness. Not just his own pain, but the accumulated suffering of an entire gallery of victims. "Beautiful," Thylos breathed, monitoring the neural readouts with the satisfaction of an artist viewing his latest masterpiece. Notice how the foreign pain experiences don't simply add to his existing suffering, they multiply it exponentially. Each sensation becomes a catalyst that triggers cascading waves of enhanced agony. Malthos, secured to his own biomechanical restraint system, watched in helpless horror as similar procedures were performed on the other survivors. Private Hendricks received modifications that transformed his skeletal structure into a resonating chamber, his bones hollowed and replaced with crystalline matrices that would amplify emotional trauma into physical sensation. The young soldier's screams took on new harmonic qualities as his modified skeleton began to vibrate in sympathy with his terror. "Your greenskin encounters taught you about the randomness of mutilation," Thylos continued, moving to Malthos with the unhurried confidence of a master craftsman approaching his most challenging project. "Ork modifications are accidents waiting to happen, crude prosthetics that might work or might explode, surgeries performed by creatures who learned anatomy by trial and error on their own bodies." The governor felt biomechanical probes beginning their preliminary mapping of his neural architecture, their touch carrying sensations that existed beyond any human vocabulary for pain. The devices weren't simply analyzing his nervous system. They were cataloging every fear, every regret, every moment of loss and despair in his personal history. "But we," Thylos said, his enhanced senses already processing the emotional landscape they'd discovered, "we practice precision modification. Each alteration is calculated to enhance not just the quantity of suffering, but its qualitative richness. We're not creating victims, we're creating living symphonies of perfectly orchestrated agony. The first modification was subtle, microscopic filaments that integrated with his optic nerves, designed to ensure that everything he saw would be filtered through a lens of enhanced emotional processing. Where normal human vision simply recorded light and shadow, his modified sight would translate every visual stimulus into waves of carefully modulated, psychological trauma. Exquisite, Thylos murmured as the neural integration proceeded. Your leadership experience has given you such a rich emotional vocabulary. The guilt over lost subordinates, the weight of impossible decisions, the fear of failure magnified by responsibility. All of it preserved and amplified through our artistic enhancement. Around them, other racks worked on the remaining PDF troopers with the business-like efficiency of craftsmen who had performed these procedures countless times. Each modification was tailored to the individual subject's psychological profile. One soldier's protective instincts were rewired to cause physical agony whenever he felt concern for others. Another's sense of duty was transformed into a source of perpetual self-inflicted torture. The difference between Ork and Drukhari methodology crystallized in Malthos's rapidly expanding consciousness with perfect, terrible clarity. The greenskins modified bodies because they found the results useful or amusing, a process driven by pragmatic brutality with no deeper purpose. But the racks were performing modifications as artistic expression, each alteration designed to create new forms of beauty through the medium of conscious suffering. The wonderful thing about our work, Thylos said, beginning the integration of more complex biomechanical systems into Malthos's enhanced nervous system, is its permanence. An Ork victim suffers until they adapt or die. Our subjects suffer until they transcend the limitations of their original biology and achieve something approaching immortal anguish. As consciousness-expanding drugs flooded his modified bloodstream, Governor Malthos realized that they weren't being prepared for quick deaths in some gladiatorial contest. They were being transformed into art installations that would grace Commorragh's galleries for millennia to come. Their capacity for suffering carefully cultivated and preserved, like precious orchids in a connoisseur's greenhouse. The Orks had wanted to kill them and forget they ever existed. The Drukhari wanted to make their agony eternal. The pleasure cults arrived with the theatrical flair of performers taking their stage, their every movement a study in lethal choreography that made Ork stormboys look like stumbling children playing at war. Siren Calixis led the cult of the pierced veil, her modified jet bike purring with anticipation as she surveyed the enhanced specimens, with the critical eye of a connoisseur selecting vintage wine. Where Ork speed freaks rode crude contraptions held together by violence and prayer, roaring through battlefields in chaotic formations that prioritized maximum daca over artistic expression, Calixis and her Hellions had transformed aerial combat into performance art. Their skyboards responded to neural commands with perfect precision, allowing for maneuvers that defied both physics and reason, while maintaining the fluid grace of dancers suspended in three-dimensional space. "Oh, delicious," Calixis purred, her voice amplified by vox grills that had been surgically implanted to produce harmonic frequencies designed to induce psychological unease. The racks have done such beautiful preliminary work, but flesh modification is merely the canvas. We provide the true artistry. Governor Malthos, his enhanced nervous system now capable of processing sensations across multiple spectrums of agony, watched through modified vision as the Hellions took their positions around the surgical bay. Their movements weren't random or tactical in any conventional sense. They were choreographed, each position calculated for maximum psychological impact on their audience of one. "Your Ork friends," Calixis explained, her skyboard executing a lazy spiral that somehow conveyed both casual grace and deadly intent. They understand speed only as a means to close distance quickly. Crude acceleration in service of crude violence. They've never grasped speed as an aesthetic medium. Lieutenant Voss, his biomechanically enhanced consciousness, now capable of experiencing the accumulated pain of thousands of previous victims, served as the first demonstration subject. The Hellions began their dance around him. Not an attack in any traditional sense, but a carefully orchestrated display of motion that existed purely to amplify his terror. They moved in patterns that exploited the enhanced visual processing his rack modifications had provided. Where normal human sight would simply track fast-moving objects, his modified optic nerves translated each Hellion's movement into cascading waves of anticipatory dread. The knowledge that they could strike at any moment, combined with the certainty that they were deliberately choosing not to, created layers of psychological torment that built exponentially with each graceful pass. "Observe the mathematics of motion," Calixis called out, her voice somehow audible despite the distance and speed of her flight. "Each trajectory is calculated not for optimal strike angles, but for maximum emotional resonance. We're not hunting your friend. We're composing a symphony in which he serves as both audience and instrument." The first actual contact came after 17 minutes of pure anticipation. A whisper-light touch from a Hellion's blade that barely parted the skin on Voss's cheek. The cut was so shallow it wouldn't have warranted medical attention under normal circumstances, but his enhanced neural pathways transformed it into a supernova of sensation that left him convulsing against his biomechanical restraints. "Beautiful," breathed another Hellion, her own skyboard executing a series of impossibly tight turns around Private Hendricks. Notice how the anticipation amplifies the actual sensation. Your greenskins would have simply opened his throat and moved on to the next target. Such waste of potential. The dance continued, each Hellion taking their turn to deliver precisely calculated touches. Never enough to cause serious damage, always sufficient to trigger the enhanced pain responses their victims' modifications had made possible. It was torture elevated to high art, violence transformed into performance that existed purely for its own aesthetic merit. Malthos found his enhanced consciousness analyzing the experience with the detached fascination of a scholar studying alien psychology. The Hellions weren't driven by bloodlust or battle madness like their Ork counterparts. They were motivated by something far more sophisticated: the pursuit of perfect moments of synchronized suffering, each victim's agony carefully orchestrated to complement the others in an ever-expanding symphony of despair. "The tension builds," Siren Calixis announced, her skyboard coming to rest in a hovering position that demonstrated the supernatural precision of her machine's control systems. Subscribe to witness more tales from the Dark Millennium, because what you've experienced so far is merely the overture. As if responding to her words, more members of the pleasure cult began arriving from the surrounding chambers. Reavers mounted on anti-grav bikes that had been modified with sensory apparatus designed to drink in the emotional emanations of their victims. Witch gladiators whose combat drugs had been replaced with substances that enhanced their empathic connection to suffering. Beastmasters, leading creatures that had been bred specifically to cause psychological trauma rather than simple physical damage. Each new arrival brought their own artistic specialty to the developing performance. The Reavers began executing high-speed passes around the chamber, their modified engines producing harmonic frequencies that resonated directly with their victims' enhanced neural implants. The sound wasn't simply loud. It was precisely tuned to trigger specific fear responses in human psychology, creating an auditory landscape that complemented the visual terror of the Hellions' aerial dance. Your orc encounters taught you about the chaos of violence, Calixis said, her modified features reflecting genuine artistic appreciation as she watched her cult's performance unfold. Random brutality, accidental cruelty, suffering as an unintended byproduct of simple destruction. But we've transcended such primitive approaches. The Beastmaster released his first creature, a thing that had once been some form of avian predator before generations of careful modification had transformed it into a living embodiment of psychological warfare. Its movements were hypnotic, each gesture calculated to trigger deep-seated phobias that existed in the collective unconscious of human evolution. Its cry wasn't simply a hunting call. It was a sound designed by alien intelligence to bypass rational thought and strike directly at the fear centers of the mammalian brain. We don't simply inflict suffering, the siren continued, her voice taking on the cadence of a philosopher explaining the fundamental truths of existence. We conduct it, we orchestrate it, we transform random agony into deliberate art that serves purposes far beyond mere cruelty. As the performance reached its crescendo, Malthos realized that they were witnessing something that existed beyond conventional concepts of torture or interrogation. The pleasure cults weren't trying to extract information or break their will. They were using their enhanced capacity for suffering as raw material for artistic expression that would be preserved and replayed for the entertainment of Commorragh's aristocracy. The Orks had tortured victims because it amused them momentarily. The Drukhari were creating eternal masterpieces that would provide aesthetic pleasure for millennia to come, and the performance had only just begun. The mandrakes materialized from shadows that shouldn't have existed in the brightly illuminated surgical bay, their forms coalescing from darkness like nightmares bleeding through the barriers between sleeping and waking. Where orc commandos relied on crude camouflage and basic stealth tactics, painting themselves purple because they believed it made them invisible, these shadow dancers existed in the spaces between light and dark, memory and forgetting. Shade Whisper Nyx emerged first, his form a constantly shifting amalgamation of living darkness and alien geometry that hurt to perceive directly. Governor Malthos's enhanced vision, modified by the racks to process multiple spectrums of sensation, registered Nyx's presence as something that existed partially outside normal reality, a being who had learned to inhabit the cracks in space-time itself. Fresh memories, Nyx whispered, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to originate from inside the listener's own skulls. So bright, so untainted by our touch. Your greenskin friends left such crude impressions. Simple violence, basic fear, the elementary emotions of primitive minds. But these specimens... His form rippled with anticipation. These hold such exquisite complexity. The other surviving PDF troopers, their consciousness expanded by biomechanical enhancement but their will still intact, watched in growing horror as more mandrakes flowed into the chamber. These beings didn't simply steal into shadows. They were shadow. Darkness given malevolent intelligence and artistic purpose. Lieutenant Voss, still secured to his biomechanical operating table, became the first demonstration of their unique craft. Nyx approached with movements that seemed to bypass the normal laws of motion, each step somehow occurring in the spaces between heartbeats, in the gaps between thoughts. Your orc encounters taught you about physical theft, Nyx explained, his form becoming more solid as he drew closer to his first subject. They steal weapons, supplies, territory, crude material things that any savage might desire, but we steal something far more precious. The moments that make existence bearable. The touch, when it came, was unlike anything the Imperial forces had yet experienced. Where the Hellions had inflicted calculated physical sensation and the racks had enhanced their capacity for suffering, Nyx reached directly into Voss's consciousness and began extracting specific memories with the precision of a surgeon removing tumors. But these weren't random memories. They were carefully selected moments of joy, peace, and hope. Malthos watched through his enhanced perception as ghostly images flickered around the lieutenant's head. His first kiss with the girl who would become his wife, the birth of his daughter, quiet moments of contentment during leave from military service, the pride he'd felt when receiving his commission. Each memory, as it was extracted, became visible as a luminescent fragment that Nyx absorbed into his shadow form. And with each theft, Voss's expression grew more hollow, more desperate, as the foundations of his identity were systematically dismantled and devoured. "Observe the artistry," Nyx continued, his voice growing richer as he fed on the stolen experiences. "Your greenskins would simply kill this specimen and move on to the next victim. Wasteful. They never understood that happiness, once stolen, can be savored forever." Private Hendricks, his modified skeletal structure already resonating with enhanced terror, became the next subject for the mandrake's attention. A different shadow dancer, this one calling itself Echo of Loss, approached with movements that seemed to occur in reverse chronology, each step somehow preceding the decision to take it. "This one holds different treasures," Echo of Loss observed, its form shifting between states of matter as it examined Hendrix's consciousness. Military pride, brotherhood with fallen comrades, the simple satisfaction of duty well performed. Such mundane joys, but with proper seasoning. The memory extraction from Hendrix was more selective, more artistically focused. Echo of Loss didn't simply steal random happy moments. It identified the specific experiences that had given the young soldier's life meaning and purpose, then consumed them with the appreciation of a connoisseur sampling rare delicacies. As each memory disappeared, Hendrix's modified form began producing new harmonics through his crystalline skeletal structure. Not sounds of physical pain, but the resonance of existential emptiness, the music of a soul being systematically hollowed out from within. "Your crude greenskin philosophy recognizes only the moment of destruction," Nyx said, turning his attention to Governor Malthos with the patient focus of a master craftsman selecting his finest materials. "They break things because breaking brings them pleasure. But we understand that the most exquisite suffering comes not from what is destroyed, but from what is remembered being destroyed." Malthos felt the shadow touch beginning to explore the architecture of his memories, probing for the experiences that had shaped his identity, the moments that made his existence worthwhile. Through his enhanced consciousness, he could sense Nyx's appreciation for the complexity of his psychological landscape. Decades of leadership decisions, relationships built and maintained, small victories that had sustained him through the grinding responsibility of planetary governance. "Magnificent," Nyx breathed, his form solidifying as he identified the choicest memories for extraction. A lifetime of accumulated meaning, carefully preserved and cherished. Your last day of freedom before accepting the governor's position. Such bittersweet nostalgia. Your daughter's wedding, the pride tempered by knowledge that she was truly grown and beyond your protection. The quiet morning when you realized you'd successfully shepherded an entire world through a decade of peace and prosperity. The theft began with surgical precision that made the rack's physical modifications seem crude by comparison. Each memory as it was extracted carried with it not just the experience itself, but the emotional context that had given it significance, the love that made relationships precious, the dedication that made achievements meaningful, the hope that made sacrifice bearable. And as each treasured moment disappeared into Nyx's shadow form, it was replaced not with emptiness, but with the knowledge of loss, the awareness that something irreplaceable had been stolen, the certainty that it would never be returned, the understanding that without these foundations, everything else in his existence became meaningless. "The beauty of our methods," Nyx explained as he savored Malthos's extracted memories like a vintner appreciating aged wine, lies in the permanence of the theft. "Your greenskin friends could only destroy what existed in the present moment, but we steal from the past, the future, and the eternal present of consciousness itself." Around the chamber, other mandrakes worked on the remaining survivors with the methodical efficiency of harvesters gathering crops. Each soldier's most precious memories were identified, extracted, and consumed, leaving behind hollow shells who could remember having once been happy, but could no longer recall why. The difference between Ork brutality and Drukhari artistry crystallized in Malthos's diminishing consciousness with perfect, terrible clarity. The greenskins had taken their lives, a simple, finite theft that ended with death. But the mandrakes were taking the meaning of their lives, stealing the very foundations of identity and purpose that made existence worthwhile. They weren't just creating suffering, they were creating beings who would suffer eternally, because they could no longer remember what it felt like not to suffer. Archon Vectis Blackthorn's private collection occupied 17 levels of the obsidian spire, each gallery a testament to millennia of refined cruelty that elevated the crude barbarism of Ork war trophies into high art. Where greenskin war bosses displayed the skulls of defeated enemies as simple monuments to their own violence, Blackthorn had created a living museum where every exhibit remained conscious, aware, and eternally capable of experiencing the full spectrum of exquisite agony. Governor Malthos, his consciousness now hollowed by mandrake memory theft but enhanced by biomechanical modification, found himself suspended in a crystalline matrix that provided optimal viewing angles for visitors while maintaining perfect life support for the specimen within. His position in the gallery's central hall marked him as a prize acquisition, the centerpiece around which lesser displays were arranged with curatorial precision. "Welcome to eternity," Archon Blackthorn announced, his voice carrying the refined accent of ancient nobility wedded to casual cruelty. "Your greenskin encounters prepared you for crude display methods. Heads on pikes, banners made from flayed skin, simple trophies that any savage might create. But observe the sophistication of true artistry." The nearest display case contained what had once been a Tau fire warrior, her blue skin now serving as a canvas for bioluminescent tattoos that shifted and flowed in response to her emotional state. The patterns weren't random. They formed equations that described her own psychological torment in mathematical precision, transforming her suffering into a visual representation of despair that updated in real time with each fluctuation in her mental state. "Chassel Mien of the Dalith Sept," Blackthorn said, with the pride of a curator describing a particularly prized acquisition. "Captured during the Third Damocles Crusade, 47 years ago. Notice how the bioluminescent implants have been calibrated to display her tactical assessments as she endlessly replays the battle that led to her capture. Each glowing symbol represents another failed strategy. Another moment of command failure that cost her troops their lives." The Tau warrior's eyes tracked movement with desperate intelligence, her enhanced consciousness forced to remain perpetually active while her paralyzed form served as a living canvas. Unlike the quick death an Ork knob might have delivered with a power claw to the head, her capture had been the beginning of an artistic project that would continue for centuries. Lieutenant Voss occupied a nearby alcove, his biomechanically enhanced nervous system now interfaced with sensory apparatus that allowed gallery visitors to experience portions of his accumulated suffering through haptic feedback. A small placard identified him as Imperial PDF Officer, modified for empathic resonance,
suitable for educational demonstrations. Your lieutenant has become quite popular with visiting dignitaries, Blackthorn noted with genuine appreciation. The combination of his military training and our neural enhancements creates such fascinating patterns of disciplined despair. Watch how he attempts to maintain proper military bearing even while experiencing the accumulated agony of 300 previous subjects. Voss's modified form trembled with the effort of remaining at attention while cascading waves of alien suffering flooded his expanded consciousness. His rack modifications had preserved his sense of duty while amplifying his capacity for pain, creating a perfect storm of torment that manifested as a military man's endless, futile attempt to maintain dignity under impossible circumstances. Private Hendricks had been incorporated into a different type of display. His crystalline, skeletal modifications transformed him into a living instrument that responded to the gallery's atmospheric conditions. As visitors moved through the space, their emotions were detected by sophisticated sensors and translated into harmonics that resonated through his modified bones, creating an ever-changing symphony of suffering that served as the collection's soundtrack. The young soldier's modifications were inspired by ancient Eldar harps, Blackthorn explained, gesturing toward Hendrix's suspended form with the casual pride of an artist discussing his technique. But where those primitive instruments could only produce beautiful music, our creation generates compositions of perfect agony that improve with each performance. The gallery's crown jewel occupied the central rotunda, a space marine of the Imperial Fists chapter, whose capture had required a full-scale Drukhari expedition involving multiple cabals and witch cults working in coordination. His yellow power armor had been replaced with a biomechanical exoskeleton that amplified his superhuman endurance into a curse, ensuring his suffering would continue long after any normal human would have found peace in death or madness. "Brother Sergeant Cross," Blackthorn announced with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. 234 years in our collection, and his capacity for righteous fury remains undiminished. Observe how his gene-enhanced physiology, designed to endure unimaginable trauma in service to his false emperor, has been turned against him. His superhuman pain tolerance simply means he can experience greater intensities of suffering without the mercy of unconsciousness. The Space Marine's eyes burned with hatred that had not diminished despite centuries of torment, his modified form straining against restraints that had been specifically designed to contain Astartes' strength. Where an Ork Big Mech might have simply chopped him up for spare parts, the Drukhari had preserved him as a living monument to the futility of Imperial resistance. "Comment your theories below," Blackthorn said, his voice taking on the cadence of a performer addressing an audience beyond the immediate gallery. What corruption stalks our heroes when hope itself becomes the instrument of their torment? Around the central displays, lesser exhibits filled alcoves and display cases with specimens from across the galaxy. Eldar Rangers, whose farsight had been perverted to show them only visions of their own eternal suffering. Ork boys, who had been modified to experience emotions beyond their primitive psychology's ability to process. Tyrannid bioforms whose hive-mind connection had been severed and replaced with an awareness of individual mortality that their species was never meant to comprehend. Each exhibit was accompanied by detailed documentation that read like academic papers describing the specific modifications, the psychological profiles of the subjects, and the artistic goals achieved through their transformation. This wasn't random cruelty. It was systematic exploration of suffering as an art form, with each specimen serving as both subject and medium for creative expression. Your greenskin friends would have displayed your skulls on crude trophies and forgotten about you within days, Blackthorn said, approaching Malthos's crystalline prison with the satisfaction of a collector viewing his latest acquisition. But we understand that true artistry requires permanence. Your suffering will be preserved, studied, and appreciated by connoisseurs for millennia to come. The governor's enhanced consciousness, stripped of its most precious memories but forced to retain full awareness of his situation, processed this information with the detached clarity of a scholar studying alien psychology. The Orks created momentary violence that served immediate purposes, but the Drukhari had elevated cruelty to the level of cultural institution, transforming their victims into permanent exhibitions that would outlive civilizations. They weren't just collecting trophies, they were creating immortal art installations that would continue to generate aesthetic pleasure for as long as consciousness persisted in their preserved forms. And in the Dark City's impossible depths, new galleries were already being prepared for future acquisitions. The Beastmaster's menagerie occupied the lowest levels of the Obsidian Spire, where specially designed ecosystems maintained collections of creatures that represented the Dark City's most sophisticated achievement in weaponized suffering. Master Chiron Vex prowled among his charges with the pride of a curator whose life's work transcended mere animal training to achieve something approaching applied psychology through biological horror, where orc beast snaggers simply captured whatever dangerous creatures they could find and pointed them at the enemy. Squigs that exploded randomly, attack squigs that bit anything within reach, boar boys that charged in whatever direction seemed most violent. Chiron's collection represented millennia of careful breeding, genetic modification, and psychological conditioning designed to maximize psychological trauma while minimizing the mercy of quick death. "Magnificent specimens," Chiron murmured as he approached the primary containment area where Governor Malthos and his surviving men had been transported for the next phase of their endless entertainment. "Your greenskin friends understand creatures only as weapons, crude tools for crude destruction, but we've elevated beast mastery to high art." The first creature released into the chamber defied easy classification. What had once been some form of canine predator had been modified through generations of careful breeding and surgical enhancement to become something that existed primarily to generate specific fear responses in humanoid psychology. Its movements weren't simply predatory. They were calculated to trigger deep-seated phobias that existed in the collective unconscious of evolved intelligence. "Observe the empathy hound," Chiron explained, his voice carrying the tone of a professor delivering a lecture to distinguished colleagues. "Your orcs would train attack squigs to simply bite and tear until something died. Effective perhaps, but artistically barren. This beautiful creature, however, has been modified to sense and feed upon emotional distress." The beast approached Lieutenant Voss with movements that somehow conveyed both predatory hunger and psychological insight. Its enhanced senses didn't simply detect physical weakness. They mapped the lieutenant's emotional state with the precision of a medicae conducting a psychological evaluation. Each step was calculated to amplify specific anxieties. Each pause timed to build anticipation to unbearable levels. When the creature finally made contact, it wasn't an attack in any conventional sense. Instead, it began to purr, a sound that had been modified through generations of selective breeding to resonate at precisely the frequency that triggered protective instincts in human psychology. The lieutenant's biomechanically enhanced nervous system translated this pseudo-comfort into cascading waves of guilt as his consciousness processed the contradiction between the creature's apparent affection and his knowledge of its true nature. "Beautiful," Chiron breathed, monitoring biometric readouts that displayed the complex interplay of emotions the interaction was generating. "Notice how the creature's apparent vulnerability manipulates his protective instincts. Your greenskins would simply set attack squigs loose and hope for spectacular violence. We create scenarios where the victim's own compassion becomes the instrument of their torment." The second creature was even more sophisticated. A thing that had once been avian but now existed primarily as a delivery system for precisely calibrated psychological manipulation. Its song wasn't simply beautiful. It was mathematically designed to evoke specific memories in human consciousness, then twist those recollections into sources of existential despair. "The memory siren," Chiron announced, as the creature took its perch near Private Hendrix's modified form. 47 generations of selective breeding have produced a being whose vocalizations can trigger recall of specific emotional experiences, then corrupt those memories into sources of endless self-recrimination. The song that emerged from the creature's modified throat was hauntingly beautiful, a melody that seemed to contain echoes of every lullaby, every love song, every moment of peace and contentment that had ever existed. But as Hendrix listened, his crystalline skeletal modifications began resonating with harmonics that transformed those recalled moments of joy into sources of profound loss. His enhanced consciousness could remember being happy, could recall the specific experiences the memory siren's song evoked. But the mandrake's memory theft had stolen the emotional context that made those experiences meaningful. He was forced to experience the form of joy without its substance, the shadow of contentment without its reality. "Your orc encounters taught you about random violence delivered by simple beasts," Chiron continued, approaching Governor Malthos with a third creature that defied classification entirely. "Attack squigs that bite whatever comes within range, boar boys that charge in straight lines until they hit something solid, predictable, boring. No appreciation for the subtle arts." This final creature was Chiron's masterpiece, a being that had been bred and modified specifically to serve as a living embodiment of hope perverted into torment. Its appearance was calculated to trigger protective responses in sentient minds, large eyes that conveyed innocence, movements that suggested vulnerability, vocalizations that mimicked the distress calls of young mammals across multiple species. "The mercy beast," Chiron said with obvious pride as the creature approached Malthos's restraint system. "Every instinct in your enhanced consciousness will scream at you to protect this innocent creature from harm, but observe what happens when you attempt to provide comfort." The beast's apparent distress was heartbreaking, whimpers that seemed to convey suffering beyond its ability to understand, movements that suggested injury or illness, eyes that pleaded for help with the desperation of the truly helpless. Malthos felt his modified consciousness responding with waves of protective instinct that his current situation made impossible to fulfill. But when he attempted to offer comfort, even the simple psychological gesture of emotional sympathy, the creature's biomechanical modifications detected and absorbed that compassion, converting it into energy that fueled its apparent suffering. The more he tried to help, the worse its distress became, creating a feedback loop where his own empathy became the source of the creature's endless torment. "Exquisite," Chiron murmured, monitoring the complex interplay of emotions his creations were generating. "Your greenskins would have fed you to attack squigs and called it entertainment. We've created an ecosystem where your own moral virtues become the instruments of perpetual psychological torture." Around them, other creatures moved through the chamber with the patient confidence of predators who knew their prey could never escape. Each beast represented a different approach to the same fundamental principle, the weaponization of positive emotions into sources of endless suffering. Love transformed into guilt, compassion perverted into complicity, hope corrupted into despair. The difference between orc beast handling and Drukhari creaturecraft crystallized in Malthos's enhanced consciousness with perfect, terrible clarity. The greenskins used animals as simple weapons, crude tools for crude destruction that served immediate tactical purposes. But Chiron's menagerie represented something far more sophisticated. Biological systems designed to transform their victims' own humanity into perpetual sources of self-inflicted torment. They weren't just being attacked by alien creatures, they were being forced to participate in their own psychological destruction through the corruption of their most fundamental moral instincts. And in the depths of the menagerie, more creatures were even now being prepared for the next phase of their endless entertainment. The Coven laboratories of Homunculus Supreme Urian Rakath represented the pinnacle of scientific achievement wedded to artistic vision, where the crude experimentation of orc mechs, randomly bolting metal plates to wounded boys and hoping for the best, was elevated into systematic exploration of suffering as an energy source that could power entire districts of the Dark City. Governor Malthos, his consciousness expanded by biomechanical enhancement but hollowed by memory theft, found himself suspended in a crystalline analysis chamber that monitored not just his physical responses, but the quantum fluctuations of his psychic emanations as they were generated, refined, and harvested by apparatus that defied Imperial scientific understanding. "Fascinating readings," Urian murmured, his grotesquely modified form moving with the fluid grace of a master surgeon examining his most prized specimen. "Your crude greenskin encounters generated such simple energy patterns, basic fear, elementary pain, the primitive emissions of minds driven by survival instinct. But properly cultivated suffering." He gestured toward the biometric displays that showed cascading waves of complex emotional energy. Properly cultivated suffering can illuminate entire sectors. The laboratory around them pulsed with organic machinery that seemed to exist at the intersection of technology and living tissue. Where orc mechs built crude devices that functioned through accidental engineering and wishful thinking, Urian's apparatus represented millennia of systematic research into the fundamental nature of consciousness, pain, and the energy that suffering generated when refined through proper scientific methodology. Lieutenant Voss served as the primary demonstration subject. His biomechanically enhanced form interfaced with collection apparatus that drew off the psychic emanations his modified nervous system generated under carefully controlled conditions. Unlike the random torture that orc painboys might inflict for their own crude amusement, every sensation Voss experienced was precisely calibrated to produce optimal energy output. "Observe the refinement process," Urian explained, manipulating controls that adjusted the intensity and quality of stimuli delivered to Voss's enhanced nervous system. "Your orcs understand pain only as a byproduct of violence, wasteful, inefficient, artistically bankrupt. But we've learned to cultivate suffering like any other renewable resource." The energy collection system that interfaced with Voss's consciousness was a marvel of Drukhari engineering that operated on principles that would have driven Imperial tech priests to madness. Crystalline matrices that resonated with specific emotional frequencies. Biomechanical converters that transformed psychological trauma into usable power. Storage systems that could preserve the essence of suffering for decades without degradation. "Each emotion generates its own unique energy signature," Urian continued, adjusting the apparatus to demonstrate his point. "Fear produces rapid, high-frequency pulses ideal for powering tactical systems. Despair generates deep, sustained waves perfect for long-term storage. But hope perverted into disappointment." He fine-tuned the controls, and Voss's biometrics spiked as his enhanced consciousness was forced to experience a simulation of rescue that dissolved into renewed captivity. Hope perverted into disappointment creates energy cascades that can power entire spires for months. Private Hendricks had been connected to a different type of collection system, one that harvested the harmonic resonances his crystalline skeletal modifications produced when subjected to specific emotional stimuli. His modified bones didn't simply create music from his suffering. They generated acoustic frequencies that could be converted into usable energy through harmonic resonance chambers. The beautiful efficiency of the system, Urian said with obvious pride as he monitored Hendrix's energy output, lies in its sustainability. Your greenskin friends would torture a prisoner until they died, then move on to the next victim. Wasteful. We've learned to maintain our subjects in optimal condition for perpetual energy generation. The apparatus keeping Hendrix alive was a masterpiece of biomechanical engineering that operated on principles that violated every law of imperial medical science. Nutrients delivered directly to his cellular structure, waste products eliminated before they could accumulate. Neural stimulation that prevented the merciful numbness that usually accompanied extreme trauma. His body had become a living power plant that could generate energy from suffering for centuries without requiring replacement. Governor Malthos, suspended in his analysis chamber, served as the laboratory's most sophisticated subject. His enhanced consciousness, stripped of its most precious memories but forced to retain full awareness, generated complex psychic emanations that Urian's apparatus could analyze, refine, and convert into multiple forms of usable energy. Your leadership experience provides such rich emotional complexity, Urian noted, studying readouts that displayed the quantum signature of Malthos's psychological state. Guilt over lost subordinates, responsibility for failed decisions, the weight of impossible choices, each emotion layered upon the others to create energy patterns of extraordinary sophistication. The collection process was itself a form of artistry that elevated crude orc methodology into high science. Where a mech might randomly electrocute a prisoner and marvel at the sparks, Urian's apparatus delivered precisely calibrated stimuli designed to trigger specific emotional responses that generated optimal energy output for predetermined purposes. Consider the applications, Urian said, gesturing toward displays that showed the Dark City's power grid, drawing energy from thousands of similar collection systems. Your imperial cities rely on plasma reactors, promethium generators, crude mechanical systems that require constant maintenance and fuel. We've learned to power entire civilizations on the renewable resource of conscious suffering. Around them, other specimens hung in similar collection apparatus, beings from across the galaxy whose capacity for suffering had been enhanced and optimized for maximum energy generation. Eldar, whose psychic sensitivity had been amplified to generate cascading waves of empathic agony. Tau, whose rational minds had been modified to experience logical paradoxes as physical pain. Space Marines whose gene-enhanced endurance had been perverted into perpetual sources of renewable torment. The most elegant aspect of our methodology, Urian continued, adjusting controls that modulated the intensity of Malthos's experience, is its artistic merit. We're not simply extracting energy, we're creating beauty through the systematic exploration of consciousness itself. Each subject becomes both power source and artistic medium. The laboratory's crown jewel was a massive collection system that drew energy from hundreds of subjects simultaneously, their combined suffering refined and converted into power that fed directly into Commorragh's primary grid. The apparatus operated with the precision of a symphony orchestra, each individual's torment carefully orchestrated to complement the others in an ever-expanding crescendo of harvested agony. Your greenskin encounters taught you about the waste inherent in primitive violence, Urian said, monitoring the system's output with the satisfaction of a master engineer viewing his greatest achievement. They destroy rather than create, consume rather than cultivate, kill rather than preserve. But we've transcended such limitations. The difference between Orc methodology and Drukhari science crystallized in Malthos's enhanced consciousness with perfect, terrible clarity. The greenskins inflicted suffering as an accidental byproduct of their natural brutality, waste heat from the engine of their violence. But the Dark Eldar had learned to cultivate conscious agony as a renewable resource, transforming the capacity for suffering into the foundation of their entire civilization. They weren't just being tortured, they were being converted into living power plants that would fuel the Dark City's impossible splendor for millennia to come. The soul galleries of the Cabal of the Flayed Skull represented the ultimate expression of Drukhari artistry, a vast complex where the very essence of consciousness itself was displayed, traded, and appreciated like rare vintages in the collection of cosmic connoisseurs, where orc weird boys might accidentally absorb psychic energy during their crude rituals, then explode spectacularly when they couldn't control the power. These chambers contained systematic harvesting operations that had refined the extraction of souls into high science. Sybarite Vexra Shadowthorn moved through the galleries with the reverent steps of a curator in a sacred museum, her modified form trailing wisps of captured essence that sparkled with the colors of stolen dreams. Governor Malthos, his consciousness now expanded to perceive multiple layers of reality simultaneously, could see the spiritual emanations that surrounded each display like halos of crystallized anguish. "Behold the true treasury of the Dark City," Vexra announced, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated directly with the psychic frequencies of conscious suffering. "Your greenskin friends understand only the crude theft of material possessions, weapons, scrap metal, the simple treasures that any savage might desire. But we trade in commodities far more precious, the immortal essence of sentient awareness itself." The nearest display case contained what appeared to be a simple crystalline matrix, its faceted surface pulsing with internal light that shifted through spectrums visible only to enhanced perception. But Malthos's modified consciousness could perceive the truth. Trapped within that crystal was the complete spiritual essence of what had once been a human being, their soul preserved in perfect clarity for eternity. Colonel Thaddeus Mordian of the Cadian 47th, Vexra explained with the pride of a collector describing a particularly rare acquisition. Captured during the defense of Casa Holn, his soul extracted while his physical form still lived. Notice how the essence retains complete self-awareness. He knows exactly what has happened to him, understands his eternal predicament, but remains powerless to change his circumstances. The soul crystal pulsed with patterns that conveyed desperate communication attempts, the spiritual equivalent of screaming, pleading, bargaining for release that would never come, unlike the quick death an orc warboss might have delivered with a power claw. The colonel's capture had been the beginning of an existence that would continue in crystalline imprisonment until the heat death of the universe. Lieutenant Voss's physical form still hung in the laboratory chambers above, but his spiritual essence now resided in a crystal of extraordinary clarity that had been positioned to provide optimal viewing angles for gallery visitors. His soul retained complete awareness of his situation, trapped in crystalline perfection, while his body continued to generate energy through systematic torture, creating layers of existential horror that built exponentially with each moment of consciousness. "The beauty of soul extraction," Vexra continued, approaching Private Hendrix's essence crystal with reverent appreciation, "lies in its permanence. Physical torture, however artistically applied, eventually destroys the subject through accumulated damage. But souls?" She caressed the crystal's surface with modified fingertips that could perceive psychic emanations directly. "Souls can suffer forever without degradation." Hendrix's crystalline prison pulsed with the harmonic frequencies his physical modifications had generated, but compressed into spiritual form and amplified beyond any possible physical experience. His soul existed in perpetual resonance with the accumulated suffering of every being who had ever experienced his particular form of crystalline enhancement, an echo chamber of agony that stretched across time and space. The gallery's central display commanded attention through sheer, impossible beauty. A massive crystalline construct that contained dozens of souls arranged in artistic harmony, their combined essence creating patterns of light and sound that served as the ultimate expression of suffering transformed into aesthetic achievement. Each individual consciousness remained distinct and aware while being forced to participate in a symphony of spiritual torment that had been playing for millennia. "The choir eternal," Vexra announced with obvious reverence. 73 souls from 17 different species, each one selected for their unique spiritual resonance and arranged to create perpetual harmony from their combined anguish. "Your greenskins would have simply killed these specimens and forgotten about them. We've created immortal art." Governor Malthos felt the apparatus beginning to extract his own spiritual essence, the process somehow more intimate and violating than any physical modification he had endured. Where the biomechanical enhancements had altered his body and the memory theft had hollowed his past, this extraction was targeting the fundamental core of his existence, the irreducible essence that made him uniquely himself. "Your leadership experience provides such complex spiritual harmonics," Vexra observed, monitoring the extraction process with professional fascination. The weight of command, the guilt of necessary sacrifices, the love for subordinates transformed into responsibility for their suffering, all preserved in perfect crystalline clarity for eternal appreciation. The soul extraction process revealed the fundamental difference between Ork and Drukhari approaches to consciousness itself. Where greenskins might accidentally absorb psychic energy during their crude rituals, usually resulting in spectacular explosions when weird boys lost control of powers they barely understood. The Dark Eldar had developed systematic methods for harvesting, storing, and trading in the essence of awareness itself. "Each soul in our collection," Vexra explained, gesturing toward gallery walls lined with thousands of crystalline prisons, represents decades of careful cultivation. We don't simply extract spiritual essence, we enhance it first, expanding the subject's capacity for awareness until their consciousness can perceive and experience realities far beyond normal limitations. The enhancement process she described was itself a masterpiece of spiritual engineering that operated on principles Imperial scholars would have declared impossible. Consciousness expanded to perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously. Awareness enhanced to experience time as a navigable medium. Emotional sensitivity amplified until the subject could feel the suffering of every being who had ever existed. "Your greenskin encounters taught you about the randomness of violence," Vexra said, watching as Malthos's enhanced soul was slowly drawn into its waiting crystalline prison. Random destruction, accidental cruelty, suffering as an unintended consequence of simple brutality. But we've elevated spiritual extraction to high art. As his consciousness was compressed into crystalline form, Governor Malthos experienced the final revelation of Drukhari methodology. The Orks had wanted to kill their bodies and forget they ever existed, but the Dark Eldar were preserving their souls in perfect clarity, ensuring that their capacity for suffering would continue not just for their lifetimes, but for eternity itself. His last coherent thought before crystalline imprisonment claimed him was the understanding that they had transcended even the concept of death. In the soul galleries of Commorragh, consciousness itself became immortal, and immortal consciousness meant immortal suffering that would never end, never diminish, never provide the mercy of oblivion. The Orks inflicted momentary agony that ended with death. The Drukhari had created eternal torment that would continue until the stars burned out and the universe itself died of cold and darkness. And even then, the crystals would endure. The final revelation came as Governor Malthos's crystalline consciousness was positioned near a display that contained the preserved essence of an Ork war boss, the first specimen that allowed direct comparison between crude greenskin brutality and refined Drukhari artistry. Boss Scarjaw of the Deaf Skull clan had been captured during one of Commorragh's rare expeditions into Orc-controlled space, and his spiritual essence now served as an educational exhibit that demonstrated the fundamental differences between primitive and sophisticated approaches to inflicting suffering. Through his enhanced perception, Malthos could observe both souls simultaneously, his own consciousness compressed into crystalline clarity alongside the Orc's spiritual essence, creating a perfect laboratory for understanding the vast gulf between their captors' methodologies and the simple violence they had originally feared. Scarjaw's soul pulsed with the straightforward emotions of a creature whose entire existence had been dedicated to immediate gratification through violence. His spiritual emanations showed patterns of simple aggression, basic cunning, and the uncomplicated joy of destruction for its own sake. Even in crystalline imprisonment, his essence retained the fundamental Orc philosophy: fight until something died, then find the next fight. "Observe the contrast," Sybarite Vexra announced, positioning the two soul crystals to provide optimal comparative viewing. The greenskin's consciousness operates on purely instinctual levels: violence as expression, destruction as art form, suffering inflicted without deeper purpose or understanding. Crude, certainly, but refreshingly honest in its primitive simplicity. The Orc warboss's spiritual torture was correspondingly elementary. His crystalline prison subjected him to endless scenarios where he was prevented from fighting, psychological torment that struck at the core of Orc identity by denying him the violence that gave his existence meaning. But the suffering was linear, predictable, limited by the simple parameters of his primitive psychology. Malthos's own crystalline imprisonment, by contrast, subjected him to suffering that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. His enhanced consciousness experienced not just his own torment, but empathic connection to every other soul in the gallery. His expanded awareness perceived the suffering of beings across multiple dimensions of reality. His modified spiritual essence resonated with agonies that existed beyond the normal parameters of mortal existence. "Your greenskin friend suffers because he cannot fight," Vexra explained, monitoring the psychic emanations from both crystals with scientific fascination. Simple, direct, comprehensible even to primitive minds. "But you, Governor, you suffer because you can comprehend the true scope of what we have accomplished." The comparison crystallized with perfect, terrible clarity. Scarjaw's torment was finite, bounded by the limitations of Orc psychology and the simple parameters of his species' emotional range. He experienced frustration at being denied combat, rage at his imprisonment, and the elementary despair of a creature prevented from expressing its fundamental nature. But Malthos experienced infinitely more complex torment. His enhanced consciousness could perceive the mathematical precision of his captor's cruelty, understand the artistic vision that transformed suffering into cultural achievement, comprehend the vast scale of the Dark City's appetite for conscious agony. He suffered not just his own pain, but awareness of the pain inflicted on countless others, knowledge of the eternal nature of his imprisonment, understanding of the purposeless beauty of his torment. "The difference," Vexra continued, "lies in the sophistication of the artistic vision. Your greenskins inflict suffering accidentally as a byproduct of their natural inclinations toward violence. They lack the intellectual capacity to appreciate cruelty as an art form, the cultural refinement to transform pain into aesthetic achievement." She gestured toward the broader gallery, where thousands of soul crystals created a sparkling constellation of compressed consciousness. Each crystal represented not just a captured being, but a masterpiece of spiritual engineering that had transformed crude suffering into refined torment, that could be appreciated by connoisseurs across multiple dimensions of existence. We, however, have elevated cruelty to the level of high culture. Each soul in our collection represents centuries of careful cultivation, their capacity for suffering enhanced beyond the limitations of their original biology, their consciousness expanded to perceive realities that would drive unmodified minds to madness. The Orc warboss's crystal pulsed with simple, repetitive patterns, the spiritual equivalent of a creature repeatedly throwing itself against the bars of its cage. His suffering was intense but limited, constrained by the boundaries of his species' psychological architecture. Malthos's crystal generated far more complex emanations, cascading patterns of light and sound that represented suffering operating across multiple spectrums of consciousness simultaneously. His enhanced awareness experienced not just his own imprisonment, but empathic connection to every other soul in the gallery, creating feedback loops of torment that amplified exponentially with each moment of consciousness. Your greenskin friend will eventually adapt to his circumstances, Vexra observed, studying the comparative psychic readings with professional interest. His simple mind will find ways to cope with imprisonment, perhaps even discover new forms of entertainment within the limitations of his crystalline prison. His suffering will diminish over time as habituation sets in. She approached Malthos's crystal with the reverence of a connoisseur appreciating a particularly fine vintage. But your enhanced consciousness prevents such merciful adaptation. Each moment of awareness brings fresh understanding of your predicament, new appreciation for the artistic vision that created your eternal prison, deeper comprehension of the purposeless beauty of your suffering. The comparison revealed the fundamental philosophy underlying Drukhari civilization. The Orks inflicted suffering because violence amused them, a simple, honest approach to cruelty that served immediate emotional needs. But the Dark Eldar had transformed suffering into the foundation of an entire culture, creating institutions and traditions based on the systematic cultivation of conscious agony as both energy source and art form. "Still with us in the darkness?" Vexra asked, her voice carrying notes of genuine concern as she monitored Malthos's spiritual emanations. "Hit that like button if this tale chills your soul, because the true horror isn't what we've done to you. It's what we've helped you become." In his crystalline prison, Governor Malthos understood with perfect clarity that he had been transformed from a victim of random violence into a participant in eternal art. The Orks would have killed him quickly and forgotten he ever existed. The Drukhari had made his suffering immortal, ensuring that his capacity for conscious agony would serve their aesthetic vision until the end of time itself. The greenskins were brutal, but their cruelty was finite. The Dark Eldar had created infinite suffering as a cultural achievement that would outlive stars, planets, and entire species. And in the impossible depths of the Dark City, new galleries were already being prepared for future masterpieces. The escape attempt began with the desperate hope that still flickered in Private Hendrix's crystalline soul, a spark of defiance that the Drukhari had deliberately preserved because, as Sybarite Vexra explained with professional satisfaction, hope corrupted into futility generated the most exquisite forms of spiritual energy. Unlike the straightforward despair of the Orc warboss, whose simple mind had already adapted to captivity, the human souls retained complex emotional architectures that could be manipulated into believing freedom remained possible. Through mechanisms that defied Imperial understanding of soul crystal technology, Hendrix managed to establish limited communication with the other captured essences in the gallery. His modified consciousness, compressed into crystalline form but retaining the harmonic resonances of his skeletal modifications, could generate psychic frequencies that bypassed the normal isolation protocols of their spiritual prisons. Governor Malthos felt the communication like whispers in a cathedral, fragments of desperate planning that somehow penetrated the crystalline barriers that should have prevented all contact between imprisoned souls. Lieutenant Voss's essence pulsed with the disciplined hope of a military officer who refused to accept defeat, even in circumstances that rendered traditional concepts of victory meaningless. The guards rotate every 73 minutes. Voss's spiritual voice carried the crisp efficiency of a tactical briefing delivered under impossible circumstances. There's a 17-second gap when the gallery's psychic monitoring systems recalibrate between shifts. If we can synchronize our resonance frequencies, the plan was as desperate as it was brilliant. A coordinated effort to overload their crystalline prisons through harmonic feedback, creating enough spiritual discharge to disrupt the gallery's containment systems and allow their consciousness to escape back into their physical forms, wherever those might be stored in Commorragh's endless complexes. But as Malthos participated in their planning, his enhanced awareness perceived layers of the situation that his fellow prisoners could not comprehend. The gallery's monitoring systems weren't simply passive observation devices. They were actively analyzing every psychic emanation, every spiritual fluctuation, every thought and emotion generated by their captive souls. The tension builds. Vexra's voice drifted through the crystalline medium with the casual amusement of a theatrical director watching actors perform exactly as scripted. Subscribe to witness more tales from the Dark Millennium, because what you're experiencing isn't escape. It's the next movement in your eternal symphony. The truth crystallized in Malthos's consciousness with perfect, terrible clarity. Their escape attempt wasn't rebellion against their captor's control. It was part of the artistic design. The Drukhari had deliberately created conditions that would allow the prisoners to believe escape was possible, then positioned monitoring systems that would detect and analyze every aspect of their desperate planning. Hope corrupted into futility. Freedom transformed into deeper bondage. Resistance perverted into participation in their own eternal torment. Execute! Hendrix's spiritual voice carried the desperate courage of a soldier leading a charge against impossible odds. The harmonic resonance they generated was magnificent. Dozens of soul crystals pulsing in synchronized rebellion, their combined spiritual energy creating cascading waves of psychic force that should have shattered every containment system in the gallery. For one impossible moment, Malthos felt his consciousness expanding beyond the crystalline barriers, touching the edges of freedom. Then, the resonance dampeners activated. The escape attempt didn't simply fail. It was absorbed, analyzed, and converted into another layer of their artistic imprisonment. The psychic energy they had generated through desperate hope and coordinated rebellion became fuel for systems designed to enhance their capacity for future suffering. Their most heroic moment was transformed into a source of power for their captor's civilization. Exquisite, Vexra breathed, her voice carrying genuine artistic appreciation as she studied the readouts that showed how their failed escape had been processed by the gallery's conversion systems. Notice how the betrayal of hope generates such pure spiritual energy. Your greenskin friend never experienced anything approaching this level of sophisticated despair. The Orc war boss's crystal had remained unchanged throughout their escape attempt. His simple consciousness, incapable of the complex planning and coordinated action that had driven the human souls to rebellion. His suffering continued on its elementary level, unaware that he was witnessing the systematic destruction of qualities his primitive psychology could never comprehend. Your greenskins understand defeat only in immediate terms, Vexra explained, positioning new monitoring apparatus around the human soul crystals to better analyze the enhanced despair their failed escape had generated. Loss of a fight, destruction of their equipment, death of their war boss, simple, finite failures that their crude minds can process and move beyond. She gestured toward Malthos's crystal, which now pulsed with far more complex patterns of spiritual emanation than before. The failed escape attempt had taught his consciousness new forms of despair that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Personal failure at the inability to free himself and his men, tactical frustration at being outmaneuvered by superior intelligence, existential horror at the realization that even their most heroic efforts served their captors' purposes. But your enhanced awareness allows you to perceive the true artistry of your situation. You understand now that every act of defiance becomes another instrument in your eternal torment. Every spark of hope transforms into fuel for the systems that maintain your imprisonment. Every moment of resistance deepens your participation in our cultural achievement. The gallery's containment systems had been enhanced by their escape attempt. The spiritual energy generated by failed rebellion converted into improvements that would make future escape even more impossible, while simultaneously providing their captors with new methods for extracting suffering from subsequent prisoners. The most beautiful aspect of our methodology, Vexra continued, her voice taking on the cadence of a professor delivering a masterclass in applied cruelty, lies in the sustainability of the despair we create. Your greenskin encounters taught you about finite defeat, battles lost, wars ended, death providing final resolution. We've transcended such limitations. In his crystalline prison, Governor Malthos experienced the full weight of this revelation. The Drukhari hadn't simply captured them for torture or execution. They had transformed their entire existence into an eternal artistic project where every human virtue became a source of inhuman entertainment. Their courage served to fuel more sophisticated torments. Their loyalty created opportunities for deeper betrayal. Their hope generated energy that powered their captors' civilization. Even their final desperate act of rebellion had been anticipated, analyzed and converted into another movement in an endless symphony of suffering that would play until the heat death of the universe. The Orks would have killed them and forgotten they ever existed. The Dark Eldar had made their defeat eternal, ensuring that even their most heroic moments would serve as entertainment for alien connoisseurs across all of time and space. And in the impossible depths of Commorragh, their failure was already being studied to create even more sophisticated methods for corrupting hope into despair in future victims. The final understanding came as Governor Malthos's crystalline consciousness was moved to the Gallery of Eternal Moments, Commorragh's most prestigious exhibition space, where the Dark City's greatest artistic achievements were displayed for the appreciation of the most refined connoisseurs. Here, in chambers that existed partially outside normal space-time, the contrast between Ork brutality and Drukhari sophistication reached its absolute pinnacle. Archon Asdrubael, Vecht himself, presided over the gallery's newest installation, his ancient consciousness bearing witness to millennia of accumulated artistic achievement that had elevated cruelty from simple violence into the foundation of an entire civilization. Where Ork war bosses might display the skulls of defeated enemies as crude trophies of their victories, Vecht had created monuments to suffering that would endure until entropy claimed the universe itself. "Behold the culmination of our art," Vecht announced, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated across multiple dimensions of reality. "Your greenskin friends understand only the moment of destruction, brief, violent, ultimately forgettable. But we have learned to make moments eternal." The centerpiece of the new installation was a temporal sculpture that captured the exact instant of Governor Malthos's realization that escape was impossible, that precise moment when hope transformed into despair, when courage became futility, when heroism revealed itself as participation in eternal torment. The sculpture existed in crystallized time itself, preserving that transformation forever in perfect, unchanging clarity. Lieutenant Voss occupied a parallel temporal matrix that displayed his moment of understanding that military discipline, the virtue that had defined his entire identity, served only to make his suffering more aesthetically pleasing to his captors. His soul crystal pulsed with the eternal rhythm of a soldier's duty, perverted into an instrument of his own destruction. Private Hendrix's essence was suspended in a harmonic resonance field that captured the infinite moment when his youthful optimism died. Not the quick death an Ork bullet might have delivered, but the slow dissolution of hope that came from understanding the true scope of his captor's artistic vision. His crystalline prison sang with the eternal music of innocence being systematically destroyed and preserved for cosmic appreciation. Your greenskin encounters prepared you for simple concepts of victory and defeat, Vecht continued, his ancient gaze encompassing the vast galleries that contained similar installations, representing millions of captured moments from across the galaxy. They taught you about battles won and lost, enemies killed and forgotten, the elementary mathematics of survival in a hostile universe. The Ork warboss's display occupied a side chamber, his simple moment of defeat when he realized he would never fight again, preserved with the same temporal technology, but generating far less sophisticated artistic resonance. His suffering was honest in its simplicity, pure in its directness, but ultimately limited by the boundaries of his primitive consciousness. But we have transcended such crude limitations, Vecht said, approaching the human specimens with the reverence of a connoisseur examining his finest possessions. We don't simply defeat our enemies, we transform their defeat into eternal art that provides aesthetic pleasure across infinite time. Every moment of their suffering becomes immortal, every instant of their anguish preserved for the appreciation of beings who understand beauty in its most refined forms. The temporal sculptures revealed the ultimate difference between Ork and Drukhari approaches to consciousness itself. The greenskins inflicted momentary suffering that ended with death or victory, their cruelty constrained by the limitations of linear time and finite existence. But the Dark Eldar had learned to capture specific moments and make them eternal, transforming brief experiences into permanent installations that would continue generating aesthetic pleasure until reality itself ceased to exist. Comment your theories below, Vecht said, his voice carrying the cadence of a performer addressing an audience that stretched across dimensions and species. What corruption stalks our heroes when even time itself becomes the instrument of their eternal torment? Around the central installation, other temporal sculptures displayed moments of corruption and defeat from across the galaxy's history. The instant when a Space Marine chapter master realized his gene seed had been tainted by chaos. The moment when an Eldar Farseer's prophecy revealed only endless darkness ahead. The precise second when a Tau Ethereal understood that the greater good was built on foundations of systematic deception. Each sculpture existed in crystallized time, its subject experiencing that moment of ultimate despair forever, their consciousness trapped in the exact instant when hope died and understanding dawned. Unlike the simple death an Ork chopper might deliver in seconds, these beings would experience their moment of absolute defeat for eternity, their suffering never diminishing, never changing, never providing the mercy of adaptation or acceptance. The most elegant aspect of temporal sculpture, Vecht explained, manipulating controls that adjusted the temporal flow around Malthos's installation, lies in its absolute permanence. Physical torture, however artistically applied, eventually destroys the subject through accumulated damage. Psychological torment may diminish as minds adapt to their circumstances, but captured moments. He smiled with the satisfaction of an artist viewing his greatest achievement. Captured moments remain forever fresh, forever intense, forever perfect in their crystallized agony. The governor's consciousness experienced the full weight of this revelation, as his awareness was locked into the eternal present of his moment of ultimate understanding. He would forever exist in that precise instant when he comprehended the true scope of Drukhari artistry, when he realized that every virtue he possessed had been transformed into an instrument of aesthetic torment, when he understood that his suffering would serve as entertainment for alien connoisseurs until the stars burned out and the universe died of cold and darkness. The Orks had wanted to kill them quickly and move on to the next fight. The Dark Eldar had made specific moments of their defeat immortal, ensuring that their most profound experiences of despair would continue providing artistic pleasure across infinite time. In the impossible depths of Commorragh, new temporal sculptures were already being prepared for future installations. And somewhere in the gallery's endless halls, the crystalline echo of Governor Malthos's final realization continued to resonate. The understanding that in choosing between the crude violence of Orks and the refined cruelty of Drukhari, they had discovered that sophistication in evil was infinitely worse than simple brutality. The Orks were savages who killed and forgot. The Dark Eldar were artists who made suffering eternal, and eternity was a very long time to scream. In the end, the comparison between Ork brutality and Drukhari sadism revealed a truth more terrible than Governor Malthos could have imagined when he first stood atop the command bunker, watching smoke rise from Settlement 7. The greenskins had been savage, yes, their crude choppers carved through human flesh, their daka turned families into red mist, their wah consumed everything in its path with the mindless hunger of a natural disaster. But natural disasters, however devastating, eventually pass. The Orks killed because violence amused them, tortured because cruelty entertained them, destroyed because destruction satisfied the fundamental drives of their primitive psychology. Their brutality was honest in its simplicity, immediate, comprehensible, finite. When an Ork boy's chopper found its mark, the victim's suffering lasted seconds. When a Big Mech's experimental torture device functioned as intended, the agony might continue for hours before merciful death intervened. Even their most elaborate gargants and war machines served practical purposes: to kill more efficiently, to destroy more completely, to achieve victory through overwhelming force. The Dark Eldar had elevated cruelty into high art. Where Orks inflicted suffering as a byproduct of their nature, the Drukhari had built an entire civilization on the systematic cultivation of conscious agony. Every aspect of their culture, their architecture, their technology, their social structures, their artistic expressions, existed to transform the capacity for suffering into aesthetic achievement that would endure across cosmic time. In the temporal galleries of Commorragh, Malthos's crystallized consciousness continued to experience that eternal moment of understanding. The Orks were brutal because they knew no better way to exist. The Drukhari were sadistic because they had chosen to perfect suffering as the ultimate expression of their sophisticated intelligence. The greenskins created momentary horror that ended with death. The Dark Eldar had created immortal art installations that would generate aesthetic pleasure until entropy claimed the universe itself. They had transformed violence from crude destruction into refined culture, from simple cruelty into complex beauty, from finite suffering into eternal torment. Governor Malthos and his men had feared the wrong enemy. The Orks would have killed them quickly and forgotten they ever existed. Honest violence in service of honest conquest. But the Dark Eldar had made their agony immortal, ensuring that their capacity for suffering would serve as entertainment for alien connoisseurs across infinite time and space. In choosing between savage brutality and sophisticated sadism, they had learned that refinement in evil was infinitely worse than primitive cruelty. The Orks were a storm that passed, leaving only destruction in its wake. The Drukhari were gardeners who cultivated suffering like precious flowers, tending their victims with the same care a botanist might show to rare orchids. And in the impossible depths of the Dark City, where shadows moved independently of their light sources and screams provided the soundtrack for an eternal symphony, new galleries were already being prepared for future acquisitions. Because while Orks might run out of enemies to fight, the Drukhari would never run out of new ways to perfect the art of conscious suffering. The Emperor's light might burn eternal, but in Commorragh's darkness, agony had achieved true immortality, and immortal agony was a masterpiece that would outlive stars, planets, and the memories of entire species. In the grim darkness of the far future, there were indeed 10,000 ways to die. But the Dark Eldar had discovered something far worse than death. They had learned to make dying last forever.